Let me bring in my guest. David, how you doing, man? You doing okay today?
Not bad, you?
I am doing fine. I'm doing fine. Better that you're joining me. We're joined with David Hundeyin. He is an investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and a 2023 James Carey Fellow at Cambridge University. David, you also, what is the name of your online program for the audience, just so they can tune in and they can be aware of it?
I don't have an online program. If you're referring to the news platform that I started
Yep.
recently, it's called The Spearhead.
Spearhead. Okay.
Yeah.
For some reason, I thought there was an
Um,
online program. Okay, it's a okay. So explain what that is, because maybe my understanding of it is wrong.
so it's essentially a news and current affairs platform which is set up to occupy the space that was vacated by African Stream when it got
Okay,
struck down by the U.S. State Department. So that's like my goal to occupy that space, which is to tell the story of the world, but from an African point of view, from an African perspective, from a Pan-Africanist perspective. That's what we're doing.
okay. I will add that to your bio just so I would have it. Um, and thank you for that. It's
Yeah.
the I remember when Africa Weekly was struck down, and this was around the same time that they got rid of
African
our
Stream.
radio station. Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
all of the stuff was taking place back to back, and it was
Yeah.
outrageous. It's a very heady and bizarre thing for a governmental body to go after you directly. That is very strange.
Yes.
It's like it's very
Yes. Yes,
nebulous.
it is.
It
Yeah.
feels very sinister.
Nothing nothing can prepare you for that. Yes.
Yeah, that's very strange. That's very weird. But I'm glad that you were able to, as you point out, occupy the space that was. I mean, obviously, you were doing something right if the U.S. government decided that they needed to go after you directly.
Yeah. Yeah. You could say that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the
But here we
eh,
are.
eh, Yeah, I mean, it's oddly enough, it's a badge of honor in a weird space. I know it's not the most comfortable thing in the world, but it's oddly enough a badge of honor. Like the U.S. government could go after a million different things, and it decided that Africa Weekly was the thing that it needed
African
to focus
Stream.
its attention. Africa Stream, I'm sorry, was the thing it needed to focus its attention on in order to remove. That's
Well, you know.
it's a badge of honor, even though it's kind of a backwards one. Um, One of the things I wanted to hit. So there was, I think it's called Guinea-Bissau. The president apparently fled after what they call a post-election coup, and
Yeah.
Umaro, I think is Sisisco Embalo, he was released. Apparently, ECOWAS, um, I guess, found a way to get him released and get him out of the
Yeah.
country, and apparently the military effectively took over once again. Is this another quote unquote junta taking over in the vein of the Sahel states, or is this something different?
This absolutely is not. This is more in the vein of Gabon or maybe
Ah,
Guinea.
okay.
So it's what you call an establishment coup, where the establishment carries out an action that resembles a coup, but the real purpose of that action is to preserve and maintain the status quo. So in the case of Gabon, when this was done in 2023, that happened at the time when there was a series of nationalist coups taking place across the Sahel region, and
Hmm.
you know West West Africa, which France considers to be its domain of influence in Africa. So, as I'm sure you may know, the three countries which remain under French influence and which France considers to be absolutely essential to its existence as an empire in Africa are Gabon, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. Now, the three coups that are taking place in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had sort of gone right across that belt. And the then president of Gabon, a guy called Ali Bongo, he had suffered a stroke recently, and he wasn't up to the task of basically maintaining the status quo any longer. So the fear was that some military officers in Gabon might be getting ideas from what was happening in Sahel, and there might be a nationalist coup that would happen. So to preempt that, the the president's cousin. Bryce Nguema, who was himself a high-ranking military officer, then carried out that coup. And basically, it was a coup where there was no bloodshed, nobody was hurt. The president's family was held for a while, and then earlier this year, they were quietly released. So there's actually a video which actually we put out on the Spearhead. It was a video that was secretly filmed by Ali Bongo's eldest son, Nuruddin Bongo, where after he was released, I think he was using a spyglass camera to record the video. And it was a meeting he had with Bryce Nguema, who has since transitioned from being the transitional president to being a civilian elected president, right? He took off his military uniform, he held sham elections, and he declared himself democratically elected. So he was having a meeting with Nuruddin Bongo, that's the oldest son of Ali Bongo, whom he deposed. And he was basically saying in this video, which is now available online, that, this is just a family affair. We had to do this because if we didn't do this and somebody else did it, it would have been catastrophic. But as you can see, we've treated you well. We didn't put you in prison. And as I've been telling Macron, that's the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, we've treated you
Mhm.
well. There hasn't been any problem. So now that we're releasing you, don't try to take any vengeance. Don't cause any rancor. Just basically disappear into the night quietly, right? So that's the coup that took place in Gabon, and that's pretty much what has taken place in Guinea-Bissau now. So the president who lost the election, it's well known that he lost the election. The establishment around him then carried out this coup, and in the process of carrying out the coup, also arrested the actual presumed winner of the election and put him
Mhm.
in detention where he still remains. Now, the president who was supposedly deposed in this coup was then released by these coup plotters. So he first went to Senegal. Now he's in the Republic of Congo under the protection of Denis Sassou Nguesso, whom I'm sure it will not surprise you to know is yet another long surviving French puppet in Africa. He's been in power, I believe, for 39 years now. If I recall correctly, might be more. So that's what has happened. It's the establishment protecting itself using the optics of a coup, but it's not a coup in the conventional sense. Definitely nothing nationalistic about it. The entire purpose is basically just to maintain the status quo.
I see. Okay. So this is not the same thing. This is basic. Okay. Maintain the
Absolutely
status
not.
quo. Wow. All right. Fair enough. Because I saw this and I was like, okay, what is this? Is this something very similar to what was taking place in the other states? Not so much. So France is maintaining a certain degree of control over, let's say, several of these states. Um,
Mm.
Guinea-Bissau being one of those states. Am I getting this wrong, or am I
Well,
understanding it
so
correctly?
Guinea-Bissau is actually it's actually a former Portuguese colony.
Okay.
So they are technically Lusophone. However, you're also not wrong in the sense that France has an outsized influence across the entire West African region. So basically, in West Africa, with the exception of Nigeria, Ghana, and maybe Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone and Liberia, which are Anglophone, the rest of the
Mhm.
region is presumed Francophone. So even the parts of West Africa which are not technically Francophone, like Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, which are supposedly Lusophone, they're kind of surrounded by Francophone countries, and they're kind of unofficially part of the Francophone project and unofficially still under some form of French influence and French domination. And even if they're not central to the France Afrique project, just the fact that if another nationalist coup were to take place in the region, amongst other things, what it would do, even if it doesn't directly affect the position of France, because maybe France is not directly invested in those countries, what it would do is that it would reduce the power of ECOWAS. So ECOWAS is the regional body, the Economic Community of West African States. If you recall, the AES, the three countries of the Sahelian Alliance, have actually backed out of
Pulled out of
ECOWAS. So
ECOWAS.
it used to be,
Right.
yeah, it used to be 15 member states. It's now 12. ECOWAS, as I'm also sure you know, is basically, for lack of a better term, it's an appendage of French foreign policy. It's been basically
Yes.
captured almost entirely by France. So if the influence of ECOWAS is waning in the sense that more and more member states are leaving, So actually, it's no longer 12 member states; it's 11. So it started with 15. Then Mauritania was the first to leave. Then Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. So it's 11 now. If Guinea-Bissau were to fall, quote unquote, to the to the same nationalist movements that is sweeping across the Sahel, then that would mean that there will be 10 member states left in ECOWAS from 15 and counting. And what that would inevitably mean is that from different directions, France is losing its ability to exert influence in West Africa. That's why, as tiny the country as Guinea-Bissau is, that's why this was a big deal.
Mm, okay. So there was a real concern that there would be an overthrow if
Yes.
this election went through. Wow. Okay. So this feeling is spreading. I mean, throughout Africa. Meaning, this seems to be a pretty aggressive move in order to prevent what
Yes.
some consider to be an actual overthrow, which means that
Yes.
the overthrow was a potential in this particular case. So this is not something that is being isolated to Sahel states. This is something that seems to be spreading throughout, at the very least, various parts of Africa.
Yes, absolutely. So I
You,
mean, and I believe I've said this before that the this is not a Sahelian issue and it's not a West African issue, it's an African issue. Even the parts of Africa which maybe have not historically been as unstable as the Sahel, maybe they don't have the security problems that the Sahel has had. The
mhm,
message is starting to get through because I think the access to information that has been provided by widespread, cheap, high-speed internet access now has made it such that a lot of people across the continent, especially the younger segments of the population, are now getting a sort of greater understanding of their position in the global political economy, if that makes sense. And they're realizing that, as against what they were told, that the reasons behind Africa's poverty were just basically corruption, and poor governments and inability to hold your government accountable, all those buzzwords. There's actually something much, much, much bigger and much uglier going on. And this is not necessarily a local thing. You're starting to understand that as long as the current system persists, the current so-called electoral democracy, which most of the continent, pretends to adhere to, which essentially is just an extension of Western influence on the continent, as long as that system persists, that you're never going to not be poor, because the current global economy requires Africa to be poor. It requires Africa to restrict itself to
mhm,
extraction of cheap raw materials and natural resources. And there is a wider understanding of that what these people in the Sahel are fighting for is not just an end to being dominated by France. They're actually fighting for the right to achieve self-actualization. They're fighting for the right to
sovereignty.
beneficiate their own natural resources, to move up the value chain, to make real money, to
Mhm,
access real value in the global economy, to have better lives, and to have the ability to provide better lives for their people. And that is actually where the crux of the matter is. That's, if you like, junction point that determines whether people get to have good lives or not. That's actually where it's located. It's an issue of national sovereignty primarily, not an issue about democracy or corruption or any of those like Western NGO buzzwords. It's actually
yeah.
an issue of basic sovereignty versus colonialism, right? So
What?
that awareness is growing across the continent. And I personally think that the Rubicon has been crossed and it can't be crossed back. So here we are.
You you wrote you were in the back and forth on your Twitter thing, and you wrote it was rather long, but there's a part of it that I want to go into. You said that's why
Mm.
one man, one vote, electoral democracy, or Western control parody of it that we practice in Africa is a terrible idea. We need firm authoritarian nationalists who understand the number two enemy of African economic and political freedom is self-destructive, externally controlled mind of colonized African humans. Dig into that. Now, the reason I'm actually digging into that because a Western audience who has this kind of emancipatory idea of democracy as the
Hmm.
greatest thing ever will recoil at this idea that one man, one vote
Of course.
is a problem. Why is one man, one vote a problem? Explain that.
Well, so the first thing that the Western audience will need to understand is that an electoral democracy in the West and an electoral democracy in Africa are two completely different things. So, an electoral democracy in the West, putting aside the fact that obviously their interests that control capital, who ultimately make the decisions and are behind the scenes controlling everything, just taking it at face value, you would imagine that an election in the West is an event where the people get to choose their own leaders, and that's the be all and end all. To a certain extent, that's how it is. We know it's not quite that simple. We know that there are ways of rigging elections in the West beyond obviously the visible stuff.
Uh-huh.
But an election in Africa or an electoral democracy in Africa is a completely different thing to anything you know in the West. The first thing you need to understand about electoral democracies in Africa is that the actual mechanics of holding an election, the institutions, the processes involved in electoral democracy are not controlled by Africans. And this is not just a thing that people say. This is something I have seen firsthand, right? Because this is an experience I have lived. I come from Nigeria, right? So when there's an election holding in Nigeria, you find out first of all there's this thing called a foreign election observer who
Hmm.
is completely ubiquitous across the whole process. Now, you're in America, I'm sure you've never seen someone from Cote d'Ivoire come to the US to observe your elections and make sure that they're
No,
credible.
no,
No, because
no.
an election in the West is understood to be a sovereign national event. In Africa, your so called election is being overseen by white people. That's literally how it works, right? So the actual process itself, you are not in control of it, right? So there's a whole network of interests, of foreign governments and embassies and NGOs who actually have more power in the supposed electoral democracy than any voter does. That's the reality. Um, the Now, assuming you can get past that layer of interference and assuming somehow you can get credible options on the ballots and hope that somehow that will lead you to Nirvana, what then happens? You realize that um, what actually swings people's decisions on voting day can be something as little as who is able to buy them a plate of rice, who's able to buy them a t-shirt,
What?
because that's actually how poor people are, right? When you see those statistics talking about people living on less than $1 a day, and it sounds all, you know, sounds like it's unimaginable. It's a reality in many parts of the continent. People really are that poor, right? And again, this is something that I have seen personally. So in such a system where people literally line up voters on election day and give them cash bribes. So it could be as little as 1,500 naira, which is roughly just over $1. That's about $1.10. And people will literally sell their votes for $1.10. So is that a democracy? Because people got to cast their ballots? My argument is that's not a democracy at all. My argument is that the person who controls capital in that system is the dictator, is the hidden authoritarian, because that's the person who will always get his way because he has the money and the people don't. And the people are so poor that they can be bought and they are bought. So, in that situation, trying to get those people who themselves are slaves to their own, to the infrastructure of their own enslavement, and who cannot seem to, you know, endure the what's the word I'm looking for? The inconvenience that it will take to break out of that system and to resist the vote buying and whatnot. In that kind of situation, what is the only realistic way of attaining some measure of sovereignty? The only realistic way is that someone or some group of people need to take control of that civic space, probably using violence, using force, and ensure that all these bad actors, be they the local controllers of capital, be they the foreign entities that have an interest in, swinging the election either way based on their geopolitical interests, that these people do not have access to the levers of political control And that's what you would then call a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime, or any of those buzzwords that we use. But the point is, those things are um they're entities of necessity, right?
Mhm.
Nobody came to this world in Africa thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great if my head of state were a military officer who carries
Right.
a gun around? Nobody thinks that. Nobody really wants that. I don't, fundamentally. But the reality is, Africa is in such a situation. And the only group of people who have the ability to ensure that an African country maintains some form, some semblance of sovereignty are those who happen to control the levels of violence, state violence. That's the only way it can work. Electoral democracy on the weak continent that currently exists is basically just an open door for any interest to come in and do absolutely whatever the hell they want to do. And that's why these Western interests cannot shut up about why democracy is so important for Africa. Because from their point of view, it's amazing, it's excellent. It gives them the things that they had to fight wars over, a century or two ago, right? If they wanted to go into a part of Africa to exploit it, to steal resources or whatever, they had to fight actual literal wars. Once upon a time, wars that spanned decades. They lost people, right? There's a part of Nigeria, southern Nigeria, which famously has a very famous name, White Man's Graveyard. And the reason it has that name is that it took them decades to actually militarily subdue this area. And this place was notorious for being a place where they just could not win. And every time they tried to win, they would get slaughtered en masse. And it's actually a historical, you can actually Google it. There's actually I think it's like a heritage site in Nigeria or something, the White Man's
Mhm.
Graveyard. That's what parts of Africa used to be once upon a time because it was that difficult to penetrate to get what you wanted from there. But now, with this democratic scheme that exists, you don't even need to put in any effort whatsoever. All you need to do is just send in an election observer and some NGO director. Those people wield more power with their iPads and their pens. They wield more power than the government of the country that they're going to do whatever it is that they're going to do it in, right? And that's because the infrastructure around this thing called democracy that has been set up in Africa is something that most people in the West have no idea about. They've never seen it before. They don't. So when people in the West use the word democracy, what they're thinking of, they're thinking of some Second Amendment, some House of Parliament, some House of Senate, House of Representatives,
Right.
separation of powers. I know my rights. Don't tread on me. Yada yada yada. That's a world away from what it means in Africa. Is a completely different thing on this continent. So, which is why I have no apologies for saying that one man, one vote electoral democratic system, which is being promoted in Africa, is a terrible idea, and it's being promoted in very, very, very bad faith by colonial entities for the worst possible reasons. And the only realistic alternative to that system now, being that this is a system that is so powerful and all encompassing. The only real alternative to it is the alternative of people who have the capacity to use the levers of state violence to enforce national sovereignty. And right now,
Mhm.
that happens to only be the military. Maybe if there were another option someday, I'll be willing to explore that too. But right now, we're in a situation where you have a choice between survival and approval. Now, the democracy comes with the approval, but you're going to die in the process, and your children are going to die poor, and their children will die poor, and their children too. But you'll be approved, or you can survive and make your way in the world like China did. But then they're going to call you authoritarian, dictatorship, blah blah blah, communist, all the buzzwords that they throw out there. But at the end of the day, I really couldn't care less about these things because at this
Right.
point, what I do care about is that so I'm 35 now. If I'm fortunate enough to have another 35 years on this planet before I leave, I want to know when I'm leaving that the Africa that I met when I came into the world in 1990 is not the same Africa that my children are going to live in, right? It's not the poverty that I became visually accustomed with and I thought of as normal before I left Africa and traveled the world and I realized just how poor we really were. I don't want that to be my kids' normal. So
Yeah.
for me, that poor people um, have no business taking part in certain conversations, right? If you're poor, you cannot be free. If you're poor, by default, you are enslaved. By default, you are enslaved to whoever controls capital. So, on a continental sense, Africa being poor means that it's enslaved to who controls capital, which is Europe and North America. It's the Western Atlantic Empire, if you like. That's just the material reality. So, the only job, the only assignment that Africa has, and that's just not with regard to political system. That's also with regard to things like energy systems. You know, Africa has no business taking part in this so-called energy transition. Right, the only job Africa has is to get itself out of poverty by any and every means possible. When you are no longer a $1,000 per capita GDP society, right? When you are $10,000 and above, when you are in proper middle to high income territory, when you have a real voice in the world, when you have military capacity that makes it impossible for someone to stage an invasion of your country, when you have real sovereignty in that respect, then you can have certain conversations, right? And then you can have all the talk about whether you want a certain type of democracy or you want this or you want that. But until then, your job is to survive. And right now, we're not surviving. Right now, we're being decimated. So the survival comes first. And I make no apologies for that whatsoever.
No, you explain it extraordinarily well. Democracy is a fig leaf. It's a tool of control. Um, it's not a show of sovereignty. It's the opposite of that. Do you see movement in that direction of this notion of economic security, or you don't see a movement towards that
It's happening in the Sahel. I wish it was happening across the whole of
other parts
Africa,
of Africa?
or at least at
Yeah.
that speed. That's not the case, but it's definitely happening in Sahel, which is why I see a lot of hope coming from that place because they get it. Like, they genuinely get it. They're not just content with being sort of sloganizing, aesthetic revolutionaries. They're actually fundamentally trying to transform the reality of their people. And even though those are localized projects, even though Burkina Faso, as I've said earlier, is not a very big country, um, Mali has limited influence in the world, or Niger. But what it will do is that inevitably over the next 5 to 10 years, when living standards become like unignorable in those countries relative to their neighbors, when it becomes visible to the blind and audible to the deaf, that these guys
Mhm.
have done something right and they have done something unprecedented, what that will do is that it will create this incredible wave of political pressure in other African countries. Because if you've been looking at these three countries have been at or around the poorest in the world for decades, right? For decades, the annual GDP rankings had Niger and Burkina Faso constantly swapping places in the bottom two, constantly swapping places. This year is Niger, next year is Burkina Faso at the bottom. And then all of a sudden, 2022, Burkina Faso has a revolution. The following year, Niger has a revolution. And next thing you know, between 2022 and 2025, Burkina Faso's economy has expanded cumulatively 43% in three
Wow.
years. So, which means in another 3 to 4 years, the economy of Burkina Faso would have effectively doubled since 2022. I doubt whether Burkina Faso, like, how many decades did it take Burkina Faso's economy to double from independence in 1960?
Yeah.
And it's going to do that in less than a decade. So again, the results are going to speak for themselves, and the rest of Africa is going to be unable to ignore it. And then the political pressure at home, across, especially among their neighbors, is going to become completely unignorable. Um, I'm pretty sure that there are a few people in the region, a few, Western aligned heads of state in the region who are very worried. People like Alassane Ouattara, I'll be very worried if I were him too, because I think he'll be among the first to be swept away by that wave when it happens, because
Well,
he has affixed himself as the spearhead of French colonialism in West Africa. Everything bad that France wants to do in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire is a staging point, right? I mean, I don't think I need to explain the role that he personally plays in West Africa. He's what he is, right? He's a puppet. But
Mhm.
when that wave of pressure begins, and Burkina Faso, which for decades has been Cote d'Ivoire's poor cousin for the longest time, and then when Burkinabe start having a standard of living that is equivalent to or greater than that of Ivorians, there's going to be an almighty wave of questions to answer, which he's not going to be able to answer. And there's going to be a real problem, not just for him, but for France. Because once he goes, and once the French puppeteering of Cote d'Ivoire goes, then the only sort of bulkheads that France has left in all of West and Central Africa are basically Senegal and Gabon. Now, Senegal, it's already not on it's not on the strong footing in Senegal that it once was on. Already, it's had to evacuate its military from Senegal. So I believe by the end of this year, I think is when the full evacuation should have been completed. So there's no longer French direct French military deployment on Senegal shores. I believe there's still some French military deployments in Gabon and in Cameroon, but those are very, very small, relatively localized projects. So basically, the only tool that France will have left in the region will be the CFA franc, which will be the easiest thing to get rid of once there's no longer the French military on the ground to actually enforce it.
Mhm.
So it's going to be a problem for a lot of people. So the next 3 to 5 years will be very, very interesting. And I, for one, am absolutely loving it.
Oh, yeah. Wow. France is being kicked out of Africa in real terms for all intents
Yeah.
and purposes. What role does ECOWAS have in this? I mean, they're calling themselves an economic organization, but obviously, if you're pointing out that they are not attending to the needs or the economic needs of Africans, then this is also some kind of organization that is being used as a tool for external influence and control.
So the problem with ECOWAS is a similar problem with the African Union, and is that the bulk of its budget isn't coming from its member states; it's coming from Europe, right? So the European Union and France specifically play a very outsized role in funding ECOWAS. So, as I recall correctly, initially the majority funder of ECOWAS was Nigeria, when Nigeria used to
Mhm.
be Nigeria. Um, but over the past couple of decades, there's been a significant, well, let me not say, let's say over the past 35 years, ever since the US State Department explicitly identified Nigeria as a threat to its designs for Africa, um, the capacity of the Nigerian state has been severely eroded. Which is not to say that Nigeria is some innocent victim in all of this, because Nigeria, I think, it's fair to say, um, there's always been a large number of willing tools in Nigeria, and there still are. Um, but yeah, the capacity of the Nigerian state to project itself and to serve as a shield for West Africa, as it once did, has been severely eroded. I mean, once upon a time, as recently as the late 90s, Nigeria was a country that was able to deploy its military to quell civil wars in neighboring countries, as it did in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. It cannot do that anymore. It simply doesn't have the capacity even to quell disturbances on its own territory. So, with along with that loss of capacity has also come loss of its influence in ECOWAS. It used to be the primary funder of ECOWAS. A lot of the ECOWAS institutions, including the ECOWAS Secretariat itself, are physically located in Nigeria, but a lot of the funding now comes from Europe, and specifically from France and Germany. So that's the problem. So that institution is no longer a West African focused Pan Africanist institution, which is what it was designed as. That's what it was meant to be. It's no longer that. It's now turning into this fragmented, I'll give you an example of just how ineffective ECOWAS is becoming. So one of the primary reasons for existence of ECOWAS is that there must be free movement within West Africa. On paper, there
Right.
is free movement. On paper, if you have like a Ghanaian passport, you can move anywhere in the ECOWAS region without the need for a visa or anything like that. On paper, that's how it is. In practice, if you're moving between Anglophone and Francophone ECOWAS member states, they can give you a problem. So if you have a Nigerian passport, for example, and you're traveling to Cote d'Ivoire or to Togo, they can give you a whole lot of problems. It's supposed to be the customs union, free trade area, free movement area. It's supposed to be that, but in practice, it's not. In practice, if you're conducting cross-border business, you're trying to say move goods from Ghana to Nigeria, the Nigerian customs are going to ask you to pay duties for goods that came from a fellow ECOWAS member state, which goes against the ECOWAS charter, but it's a thing that happens.
Uh,
So the institution itself has become something that exists more like notionally than practically, as with many other things African. So this is what Ibrahim Traore meant when he said that ECOWAS is no longer useful to the aspirations of those who want a free Africa, and that they have to create their own institutions, which is why they
yes.
went and created the AES. And I think it was very telling when they created the AES. They didn't then create that and then sort of try to wall everybody out of it. They created the AES and then said that any ECOWAS passport holder still has visa-free access to AES. So on the one hand, they're saying that this institution is no longer useful, it's no longer in line with the aspirations of those who created it. However, the
Yeah.
the constituent members of this institution are still very much our West African brothers, and you are still welcome. We still want to do business with you. We still want you to be able to come in and move
Interesting.
out freely. So, eventually, I mean, okay, let me not say I think, let's say I hope that
AES
eventually,
replaces ECOWAS.
yes, exactly, that, um, especially if there are more of these popular revolutions that in the West African region, that the new governments will take what I think is the obvious decision and simply join the Sahelian alliance. In my sort of fever feverish wet dreams, I dream of a time when something like that will happen in Nigeria, and I'll wake up one day and hear an announcement that Nigeria has joined the AES. Because if that were to happen, I think it's fair to say that like that project would have hit maximum velocity at that point. It would have hit breakout velocity at that point, and it'd be impossible to stop. But wishes aren't horses. This is just me, throwing thoughts into the void. But
Yeah.
fingers crossed.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I see why you come to that assessment. Honestly, I do. I mean, like I said, from people in the West, they raise democracy as the highest thing in the world, and they kind of miss the point that this is Martin Luther King thing too, right? Where people forget that he was a socialist, and his argument was effectively, if you don't have economic freedom, you don't have freedom. Like, what's the point of being free to
Exactly.
die with cancer on the sidewalk, right? It's like, yeah, you don't have a house, you don't have healthcare, you don't have education, you don't have any of this stuff, but you're free.
Yeah.
It's like, dude, that's
I
not
was
a
I
freedom.
was I was making this exact point recently on I believe it was on Twitter where I said um a Nigerian will speak to a Chinese person, and the Nigerian will tell the Chinese person, I have more freedom than you. Isn't that absolutely ridiculous?
Yes.
Because the Nigerian would say, I can vote for my president, but you can't. Therefore, I have more freedom than you. Meanwhile, the Chinese person would look at the Nigerian person and think, the clothes you're wearing are made somewhere in
China.
I forget what region of China it is, somewhere in southern
Yeah.
China. The phone you're holding is made in Shenzhen. The mobile network that the phone operates on is built on Huawei and ZTE equipment, which are made in Shenzhen, and those are Chinese companies. The car that you're driving in is probably built in
Yeah.
China.
Yeah.
The railways and the trains in your country were probably built by the China Civil Engineering and Construction Company or the China Railway Construction Company. The the roads, the docks, the infrastructure, everything that you enjoy in your country was probably built by China. Everything that gives you the ability to stand up and even talk to me like this was probably Chinese. So what on earth do you mean by you have more freedom? What is freedom? And this is it's a very I personally think this is like some sort of neo-colonial psychological operation that has been activated on Africans, because why would the definition of freedom in the popular African imagination be something that is relating to some quotes from George Washington or Benjamin Franklin or something? I literally heard someone who is like born and raised in Nigeria, never left West Africa before, quoting Benjamin Franklin that he who is willing to trade freedom for security deserves neither. And I'm thinking, well, Benjamin
Right,
Franklin
right.
he owned African slaves when he made that comment.
Yeah,
Yeah, that quote was not for you. It has nothing
yeah,
to do with you. He lives in a completely different reality to you. Why are you inserting yourself into that reality? And I think, well, I don't think, I know that there's been a very, very successful messaging program to convince Africans that they live in a reality that they don't live in. So their definition of freedom should include references to Benjamin Franklin. Their idea of what it means to be politically free, for some reason, should not include freedom to be able to feed your kids, should not include freedom to be able to get treated in the hospital and not go bankrupt while you're at it, or to even have the facilities to even treat whatever ailment that you're suffering from. Somehow, all of those freedoms don't constitute freedom. The only thing that constitutes freedom is this narrow band of Western designated issues that constitute freedom. So freedom means freedom of the press, or what they call freedom of the press, because they definitely don't have a free press. But what they call freedom of the press, freedom of religion and worship, supposedly, freedom of speech, supposedly, what they call freedom of speech, um, freedom of civil society. This very narrow band of things that somehow have been designated as the ultimate freedoms that are worth everything and everything. But somehow, freedom to have food in your stomach, freedom to have
economic.
a house to live in, those things are not considered freedoms. Among
Yeah,
the world's poorest
economic
people, who
liberation.
who decided that?
Yeah, economic liberation is the pathway to freedom, from my point of view. It has to be. Otherwise, what's the point? Right. David, man, I've enjoyed this conversation. I always enjoy these conversations with you. You always give food for thought and something, and this kind of explanation that we may not necessarily get from the side of the world. Thank you for this. David Hundeyin, he's an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. He also runs Spearhead. It is a news channel, news and current affairs platform for African topics, African issues. David, thank you for this, man. You be safe, okay?
All right, thank you for having me.
Have a good one. Bye bye. All right. Shout out to David. He always gives a good